My son-in-law poured 48 hours of my soul down the kitchen disposal while checking his stock options, then handed me a dented can of generic soup and told me that old people shouldn't play with fire. The sound of the industrial-grade disposal unit was a guttural roar that swallowed the silence of the kitchen. I stood frozen, my ladle still midair, as I watched the shimmering amber silk of my consommé de volaille vanish into the dark. It wasn't just broth. It was 2 days of my life. The slow roasting of marrow bones, the meticulous skimming of impurities, and the delicate raft of egg whites and minced poultry I had used to clarify the liquid until it was as transparent as a mountain stream. In my world, the world of diplomatic banquets and national honors, this was liquid gold. In Bradley's world, and it was a temporal inefficiency. The kitchen of the Thorne estate didn't smell like a home. It was a 2,000-square-foot monument to cold luxury, all brushed stainless steel, seamless white marble, and integrated smart appliances that hummed with a sterile, predatory energy. There were no wooden spoons here, no seasoned cast iron skillets. Everything was handled by Thorne automated systems designed to minimize human contact. Bradley stood over the sink, his tailored suit jacket draped perfectly over a stool that cost more than my first car. He didn't look at me. He looked at the sleek glass surface of his Apple Watch. "Clara, look at the data," he said, his voice as flat and clinical as a surgical report. "You've been hovering over that burner since Saturday. For what? 3 gallons of flavored water? And in the time it took you to hand dice those carrots, my Quick Bite franchises in the tri-state area moved 12,000 units of our zesty zoodle bowls. That's strategic intelligence. What you're doing? That's just vanity." I felt the choking sorrow rise in my chest, a cold, sharp ache that made my 70-year-old knees feel like they were made of glass. My hands, calloused and scarred from decades in the heat of the world's most prestigious kitchens, gripped the edge of the marble island. "It's not vanity, Bradley," I whispered, my voice sounding fragmented and small against the hum of the refrigerator. "It's nourishment. It's a French master class. Mia used to say my consommé was the only thing that made her feel like the world was right." "Mia is a vice president now, Clara. She doesn't have time for right. She has time for fast," he snapped. He reached into a hidden cabinet and pulled out a yellow-labeled can of generic chicken noodle soup, the kind that tastes of tin and excessive sodium. He slammed it onto the white marble with a sound that felt like a slap. "From now on, the stove is off limits. I've had the smart sensors recalibrated to lock the burners if they detect a human presence for more than 20 minutes. It's a fire hazard, and quite frankly, it's a waste of the Thorne brand energy. Eat this. It's prepackaged, nutritionally stable, and it saves you the trouble of thinking. I don't want to come home and smell outdated spices anymore. It's confusing the air filtration system." "So this is how they repay me?" After I gave them every cent of my husband's life insurance to launch their corporate headquarters. After I moved into this mausoleum to watch their children, only to be told I was a biochemical liability in my own kitchen. Did they really think I had become that senile? That I would just sit in the corner and lap up processed sludge while my copper pots, my ancestry of brick-and-mortar, hung like decorative corpses on the wall? I looked at the can. I looked at Bradley's back as he walked away, already deep into a haptic voice call about margin optimization. I felt a sublime sense of ruin. I had been self-sacrificing to the point of erasure. I had been the ghost of sacrifice, thinking that if I just fed them well enough, they would see the soul behind the soup. But Bradley didn't want a soul. He wanted a process. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, but not from age. They were trembling with the dormant power, the quiet wisdom of 50 years of blending spices to manipulate the human spirit. He thought he had disconnected the stove, but he forgot that a master doesn't need a Thorn-automated range to start a fire. The humiliation was a seed, and in the cold white light of that kitchen, I felt it begin to sprout. "I may be old, Bradley," I whispered to the empty, expensive air, "but I am not foolish. You've forgotten who built the fire you're currently warming your ego by." The turning point was coming. He wanted me to eat canned food? Fine. I would eat his insults for now. But tomorrow I would start looking at that derelict bakery across from his corporate tower with a very different pair of eyes. My kindness was never a doormat, and Bradley was about to find out that the most dangerous person in the world is a royal chef who has been told she can no longer cook. Reflection. In the world of cold luxury, we often trade the labor of the heart for the speed of the machine. We mistake the silence of our elders for a lack of strategic intelligence. But dignity isn't something that can be poured down a drain. It is the ancestry of brick-and-mortar that remains long after the quick-bite trends have faded. Follow-up. Question. If you were Clara, would you have taken the can of soup, or would you have walked out that very night? The ache in my lower back isn't just the protest of 70-year-old vertebrae. It is the accumulated weight of 50 years spent in the trenches of the culinary world. As I sat in the shadows of the breakfast nook, watching the moon reflect off the sterile, fingerprint-resistant surface of Bradley's smart fridge, I looked at my hands. They are a map of my life. The faint white line across my thumb from a slip of a Sabatier in a high-pressure kitchen in Lyon. The mottled darker patches on my forearms from a backfiring broiler during a blizzard in D.C. These aren't just scars. They are the ancestry of brick and mortar that built the very empire Bradley now uses to crush me. Bradley and my daughter Mia see a retired grandmother who likes to fuss over pots. They have conveniently erased the woman I was before I hung up my whites. They have forgotten that I was the head chef for the Office of Language Services at the State Department. For 15 years, I was the one who translated tension into truce through the medium of flavor. I have seasoned the peace treaties of nations. I have prepared the canard à l'orange that softened the heart of a recalcitrant dictator, and the saffron risotto that made a visiting monarch finally agree to a trade deal. I understood a truth that Bradley's spreadsheets can't quantify. Flavor isn't just a sensation. It is a diplomatic tool. I mastered the sovereign blend, a secret of blending whole spices, not to mask food, but to manipulate the human nervous system. I knew that the right ratio of toasted cardamom and star anise could induce a sense of safety and nostalgia, while a hint of fermented black garlic could create a primal, addictive depth that no chemical MSG could ever replicate. I worked 18-hour shifts until my ankles were so swollen they felt like they would burst. I did it for Mia. When my husband passed away in 2010, I didn't curl up in my grief. I doubled my shifts. I worked private banquets for the ultra-wealthy, men who wanted the prestige of a State Department meal in their penthouses, just to ensure Mia could attend the Culinary Institute of America. I wanted her to have the finer things, but more importantly, I wanted her to carry the torch of truth and honor in a world becoming increasingly synthetic. Instead, she met Bradley. He didn't want the torch, and he wanted the ticker tape. He saw food as a delivery system for calories, a logistical problem to be optimized. When they came to me in 2022, begging for the capital to launch the Thorn Tower headquarters, I didn't hesitate. I gave them $400,000, every cent of the life insurance and the sovereign fund I had tucked away from decades of private service. "It's for the family, Mom," Mia had said, her eyes bright with what I thought was ambition, but now realized was materialistic greed. "We're going to revolutionize how the world eats." I thought I was investing in her dream. I didn't realize I was funding the construction of my own prison. Now, in 2026, I am a guest in a mansion I helped buy, living in a cold luxury that chills me to the bone. Every time Bradley mocks my outdated techniques, he is spitting on the 48-hour stocks that paid for his education. Every time he calls my food bland, he is insulting the palate that once dictated the menu for a G7 summit. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they think that because I moved quietly and spoke with quiet wisdom, I had lost my strategic intelligence? They see a woman who is slow, but in the kitchen, slowness is how you achieve depth. Bradley's quick-bite empire is built on the shallowest of foundations, chemicals and speed. My kindness was never a doormat. It was the investment they defaulted on. As I stared at the yellow can of soup Bradley had forced upon me, I felt the choking sorrow transform. It was no longer a weight in my chest. It was a fire in my belly. He thinks he has decommissioned a relic, and he doesn't realize he has just cleared the schedule of a master who no longer has anything to lose. So this is how they repay me? By stripping me of my tools and treating my history like an encumbrance? I may be 70, but my memory is as sharp as a paring knife. I remember every secret ingredient. I remember every diplomatic contact, and I still have the deed to that small, derelict bakery across from his shimmering glass tower. Bradley wanted to remove the chef from the kitchen. I am going to show him that without the chef, he is just a man selling flavored cardboard in a glass box. Reflection. We often mistake the silence of our elders for a lack of relevance. We assume that because their methods take time, they are outdated. But time is the only ingredient that cannot be faked. Mia and Bradley traded the ancestry of brick-and-mortar for a digital mirage, and in doing so, they forgot that the person who built the empire knows exactly where the pillars are weak. Expert guide. Question: if you had sacrificed your entire life savings for your children only to have them treat you as a temporal inefficiency, would you try to reconcile? Or would you use your remaining hidden assets to reclaim your dignity? The dining room of the Thorn estate was an architectural whisper of cold luxury, a space where the acoustics were designed to dampen the sound of human warmth and amplify the clink of silverware against fine bone china. It was Tuesday, April 7th, 2026, a date that will forever be burned into my memory as the night the fast food king officially declared war on the ancestry of brick and mortar that lived within my soul. I sat at the end of the long obsidian slab table, my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. Before me sat the yellow-labeled can of hearty chicken noodle, its lid peeled back to reveal a stagnant, oily surface that smelled of metallic preservatives and broken promises. Bradley sat at the head, the blue light from his tablet illuminating a face that had grown sharp with the delusions of power. Mia sat to his right, her eyes fixed on a bowl of Thorn Pro V, a grayish, nutrient-dense slurry that was the flagship product of their new Smart Diet initiative. The brand alignment. "Mom, you didn't even finish the serving," Mia said, her voice carrying a practiced corporate edge. She didn't look at me. She looked at the nutritional data flickering on the wall-mounted smart screen. Bradley's right. We have to live the brand. If the vice president of Thorn Operations is seen eating a high-sodium, high-fat, hand-clarified consommé, the market will perceive a lack of confidence in our automated models. We're moving toward a zero-chef future, Mom. You're cooking. It's a digital liability. I looked at my daughter, the girl I had once taught to distinguish the subtle difference between the salon and Cassia Cinnamon. Now she spoke in the language of logistics and liabilities. "Is that what I am now, Mia? A liability?" I asked, my voice low and slow, vibrating with the choking sorrow of a mother who realizes her child has been replaced by an executive. "I spent 48 hours on that broth to give you a taste of truth and honor. I did it because you looked tired. I did it because you've forgotten what real salt tastes like." Bradley let out a short, bark-like laugh, not looking up from his sales reports. "Real salt? Clara, real is a marketing term we use for the lower quartile consumers who still believe in the archaic myth of the kitchen. And in the real world, the world where Thorn's Quick Bite moves 6 million units a day, salt is a chemical compound we optimize for maximum thirst induction. Your soup isn't nourishment. It's a temporal black hole. It takes too much time to make, too much time to eat, and it creates a standard of quality that is, frankly, impossible to scale." The decree of disconnection. He finally put the tablet down, leaning forward until his shadow draped over my canned soup like a shroud. "I've made a decision, Clara, for the good of the family brand and the domestic efficiency of this household. Tomorrow the technician is coming. We're disconnecting the range and the convection ovens. They're being replaced by the Thorn Automated Reheat, TAR system. It's an RFID-based induction platform. You just wave a Thorn pack over the sensor, and then the machine provides the optimal thermal profile." He smiled, a cold, predatory expression that lacked even a spark of human empathy. No more open flames, no more sovereign spice lingering in the drapes, and certainly no more 48-hour experiments. "You're 70, Clara. It's time you stopped playing with fire and started embracing the sublime convenience of the future. The canned stuff? Think of it as a transition phase. Eventually, you'll find the tar packs quite efficient." So this is how they repay me? Did they really think I had become that senile, that I would just sit in this glass cage and let them lobotomize the only art I have left? The final humiliation. I felt the humiliation settle into my bones, colder than the air-conditioned draft of the room. I looked at Mia, silently pleading for a spark of the girl who used to steal samples of my beurre blanc, with a mischievous grin. but she just nodded, her face as sterile as the kitchen we were about to lose. "It's for your own safety, too, Mom," she added, her voice devoid of any quiet wisdom. Bradley saw the utility bills. The amount of gas you use for a single pot of stock is, well, it's a materialistic waste. We're streamlining. Everything must be smart. Everything must be Thorne. Bradley stood up, checking his watch, his true master. "The tar system arrives at 8 a.m. I expect the copper pots to be boxed up and moved to the basement by then. They're a spatial liability in a modern kitchen. Eat your soup, Clara. It's a Thorne-approved baseline." As they walked away, their synchronized footsteps echoing on the cold marble, I sat alone with the can of generic sludge. I picked up my silver spoon, a relic of my days serving at diplomatic banquets, and touched the oily surface of the soup. A clear-headed, sharp tone began to hum in the back of my mind. They thought they were stripping me of my power by taking away my stove. They thought they were silencing me by disconnecting the gas. But they forgot one crucial thing. A royal chef doesn't need a professional range to be dangerous. The hidden weapon isn't the flame. It's the knowledge of how to stoke it. They wanted a zero-chef future? Fine. I would give them exactly that. But first, I was going to show Bradley Thorne that his billion-dollar process was nothing more than a digital mirage built on the sand of human boredom. I stood up, my knees no longer aching with hurt, but with the tension of a predator preparing to strike. I didn't box up the copper pots. I walked to the pantry, opened my private ledger, and looked at the address of the derelict bakery across the street from his shimmering tower. "You've forgotten who built this empire, Bradley," I whispered to the empty obsidian table, "and you're about to find out how quickly a foundation of chemicals can crumble when it meets the truth of real salt." Strategic question. In a world that values smart systems over human mastery, is it better to fight the machine from the inside or to build a new fire where everyone can see it? The morning of April 8th, 2026 arrived with a clinical gray light that seemed to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Thorne estate, offering no warmth, only visibility. I stood in the corner of the kitchen, my arms wrapped around my chest as if to hold my own dignity together, watching a young technician in a Thorne-Tech jumpsuit dismantle my world. He worked with a silent mechanical efficiency, his wrench clicking against the manifold of my professional-grade 6-burner gas range. Bradley stood over him, clutching a tablet like a general overseeing a conquered territory. He was checking off items on a digital list, his face illuminated by the flickering blue light of domestic optimization. "It's for your own safety, really, Clara," Bradley said, his voice dripping with a performative, but materialistic concern that felt like a coat of cheap varnish. Statistics show that 70% of home fires in this demographic are caused by archaic cooking methods, open flames, forgotten burners, and the over-simmering of liquids. We're installing the Thorne Automated Reheat, TAR system. It's smarter than a stove. It recognizes the RFID tags on our Thorne packs and provides the exact caloric thermal profile needed. No more experiments, no more risks. I watched the technician pull the heavy brass knobs from the range, the knobs I had turned 10,000 times to find the perfect framir, that barely there simmer where the water just shivers. He tossed them into a plastic bin with a hollow plastic sound. "You're taking my tools, Bradley," I said. my voice low, slow, and fragmented, and it felt like the air in the room had become too thin to breathe. A chef without a flame is just a spectator. I spent 30 years in the heat of the State Department. I've handled fire that would make your smart sensors melt. Did you really think I had become that senile? That I'd just forget? Bradley finally looked at me, and I saw the delusions of power dancing in his pupils. It's not about memory, Clara. It's about control. In my company, we don't leave things to intuition. Intuition is just another word for unpredictable error. You're a relic of a time when people had nothing better to do than wait for a pot to boil. This is the future, the slurry of the machine. By noon, the kitchen was a tomb. The gas line had been capped. The copper pots moved to the damp shadows of the basement, and the sleek, induction-based TAR platform sat where my range used to be. It looked like a flat black mirror, incapable of creation, only of reheating. Bradley had left a single yellow-labeled can of hearty chicken noodle on the counter. "Try it, Clara," he'd whispered before leaving for the office. "It's the baseline for our next global rollout. It saves the trouble of thinking." I sat at the obsidian table and peeled back the lid. I didn't heat it. I wanted to taste the materialistic soul of his empire in its rawest form. I dipped my silver spoon into the liquid. It was a stagnant gray-gold slurry. I closed my eyes, letting my palate, the hidden weapon I had spent 50 years honing, dissect the lie. It was a chemical massacre. I tasted the metallic tang of the tin, followed by a violent, artificial spike of sodium. Then came the chicken, mealy, overprocessed cubes of soy protein isolate and ammonia-treated scraps that had never known the resistance of real muscle or the richness of fat. Underneath it all was the cloying, oily sweetness of high-fructose corn syrup used to mask the lack of real vegetable sugars. It was a biochemical liability, masquerading as comfort. So this is how they repay me? After I sold my husband's land to fund his first franchise? After I worked double shifts at the State Department to pay for the cold luxury they now use to choke me? Did they really think I had become so diminished that I wouldn't recognize a crime against the tongue? The realization of control. I felt a choking sorrow for Mia, my daughter, who once had a palate so sensitive she could identify the vintage of olive oil by smell, but was now eating this sludge in the name of brand alignment. Bradley wasn't just an efficiency king. He was a man who hated anything he couldn't quantify or automate. He hated my cooking because it required a human presence. It required a quiet wisdom that his algorithms couldn't replicate. He feared the chef because the chef knows the truth. You cannot automate love, and you cannot optimize a soul. I looked out the window. Across the 4-lane highway, the glass spire of Thorn Tower caught the afternoon sun, looking like a jagged shard of ice. And there, tucked into the shadow of the skyscraper, was the derelict brick bakery I had noticed before. It was a small, stubborn anchor of the ancestry of brick-and-mortar in a sea of glass. A clear-headed, sharp tone began to vibrate in my mind. The sorrow didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It became a weapon. Bradley wanted to remove the chef from the kitchen. Fine. I would move the kitchen to the one place he couldn't reach with his wrenches and his smart sensors. I wasn't just a grandmother in a domestic sphere. I was a royal chef. I had the strategic intelligence of someone who had navigated the egos of world leaders. If Bradley Thorne wanted a war of efficiency, I would give him a war of essence. I would show him that his billion-dollar process was nothing more than a digital mirage that would evaporate the moment people tasted the truth of real salt and honest fire. My kindness was never a doormat. It was the foundation he was currently standing on. And as I looked at the yellow can of sludge, I realized that foundations can be pulled out from under a king faster than he can check his stock options. Reflection. We often think that by taking away a person's tools, we take away their power. But power isn't in the stove. It's in the quiet wisdom of the hands that have spent decades in the heat. Bradley Thorne made a fatal mistake. He thought he was disconnecting a range, but he was actually removing the only thing that kept his digital mirage from collapsing into the truth. Follow up. Question. If someone took away the one thing that defines your passion, would you mourn the loss, or would you find a way to build it again right in front of their eyes? That afternoon, while the smart home sensors hummed with a sterile, watchful energy, I retreated to my bedroom. It was the only space in this house of cold luxury that still smelled faintly of the past, a mixture of lavender sachets and the ghost of the turpentine. I once used to clean my old wooden spice boxes. From my window, I had a clear line of sight to the shimmering, jagged glass spire of Thorne Tower downtown. It looked like a monument to the digital mirage Bradley was selling. Fast, shiny, and utterly hollow. Directly across from his towering headquarters sat a small, two-story derelict brick building. It was an old bakery that had been boarded up since the early 2000s, a stubborn remnant of the ancestry of brick-and-mortar that Bradley's architects had failed to pave over. A decisive heat began to radiate from my chest as I looked at it. The cedar box of secrets. I knelt by the side of my bed, my joints protesting with a dull ache that reminded me of my hard-working years on the line. I pulled a heavy cedar-lined box from the back of the closet. This wasn't a jewelry box. It was a reliquary of truth and honor. Inside were the fragments of a life Bradley and Mia had chosen to forget. A letter of commendation from the Office of Language Services, signed by a former Secretary of State. A photograph of me in my whites, standing between two world leaders who were smiling over a shared plate of my Coke au vin. A small, leather-bound ledger that held the key to my strategic intelligence. Most people, including my own daughter, believed I had handed every cent of my husband's life insurance to Bradley to fund his Thornpuck expansion. I had let them believe it. I had been the ghost of sacrifice, playing the role of the aging mother with a diminished portfolio. But a woman who has navigated the diplomatic kitchens of the world knows the vital importance of a sovereign fund. The hidden assets. I opened the ledger. Behind a false bottom in the binding lay a set of encrypted account details and investment certificates. Years ago, while I was catering private six-figure banquets for the old money families of D.C., the ones who despised Bradley's brand of fast food efficiency, I hadn't just spent my earnings. I had invested in a small, artisan spice importing firm that specialized in rare lutein-rich saffron and fermented black garlic. That firm had been acquired by a global conglomerate 3 years ago. My stingy habit of saving every cent from those private banquets had blossomed. Did they really think I had become so senile that I would forget how to manage a kitchen's budget, or my own? My kindness was never a doormat. It was a strategic reserve. The sovereign fund was currently sitting at approximately $1,240,000. It was a liquid weapon hidden in plain sight, far removed from Bradley's smart finance monitoring. The strategic realization. I looked back out the window at the derelict bakery. I could see the for-lease sign, faded and flapping in the wind. Bradley wanted to remove the chef from the kitchen, and he wanted to replace human intuition with a digital mirage of automated reheating. Fine. I would move the kitchen into his front yard. I felt my quiet wisdom sharpen into a tactical plan. I wasn't just going to open a restaurant. I was going to launch a sensory siege. I knew the secrets to blending spices to create an addictive primal craving that no Thorn-automated system could replicate. I had the capital, I had the technique, and I had the motivation of a woman who had been told she was outdated. The turning point. I picked up my phone, the archaic model Bradley mocked, and dialed a number I hadn't called in a decade. It belonged to Marcus, a retired real estate lawyer who owed me his career after I'd mediated a dinner that saved his firm from a merger disaster in the 90s. Marcus, I said, my voice no longer fragmented, but firm and decisive. I need you to acquire the old bakery on 4th and Main, the one directly across from the Thorn Tower lobby. I want it done anonymously. Use the sovereign fund. There was a pause on the other end. Clara, I thought you were retired, living the quiet life. I was, I replied, watching a Thorn delivery truck pull into the tower's loading dock across the street. But I've realized that some things are too important to leave to the efficient. I'm coming back to the fire, Marcus, and this time I'm bringing the salt. The humiliation Bradley had forced upon me by disconnecting my stove was the greatest mistake of his life. He had cleared my schedule. He had given me the one thing a royal chef needs most, a reason to fight. The ancestry of brick-and-mortar was about to take a stand against the glass, and then Bradley was about to find out that his billion-dollar process was no match for a master who knew exactly how to spice the truth. Strategic question. When the world tries to optimize you out of existence, do you retreat into the silence they've assigned you? Or do you use your hidden reserves to build a new world in their front yard? The air in the old bakery tasted of history, a dry, yeasty silt that had settled into the floorboards over a decade of silence. It was a sharp, spatial contrast to the pressurized, lavender-scented oxygen of the Thorn estate. Here, inside these red brick walls, the light didn't flicker with the blue glow of a tablet. It poured through the grime-streaked windows in long, golden slants, illuminating the dust motes like tiny hovering stars. Across the street, the Thorn Tower loomed, a jagged needle of glass piercing the April sky. I stood at a battered wooden workbench I had reclaimed from the cellar, my fingers tracing the deep grooves in the grain. Bradley thought he had won when he disconnected my gas line. He believed that by removing the process of a kitchen, he could erase the intuition of the chef. But he had made a fatal error in his strategic intelligence. He forgot that I am a scientist of the soul, the architecture of umami. In the world of diplomatic banquets, you don't just feed a man, you disarm him. I spent 15 years at the State Department perfecting the sovereign spice. Bradley's thorn pucks relied on crude chemical additives, monosodium glutamate, and disodium inosinate to force the brain into a state of artificial satiety. It was a digital mirage of flavor, a high-frequency scream that left the palate exhausted and the body hollow. My weapon was different. It was an archaic mastery of neurogastronomy. I spent those first nights in the bakery cellar, hunched over a stone mortar and pestle, my hands aching with a hard-working rhythm that felt like a prayer. I wasn't just grinding plants, and I was building a biological umami bomb. The base, fermented black garlic, aged until it reaches a concentration that tastes of balsamic vinegar and dark chocolate. The catalyst, sun-dried kelp from the North Atlantic, rich in natural glutamates that provide a deep oceanic resonance. The heart, shiitake mushrooms, pulverized into a dust so fine it could float on a breath, providing the earthy 5' guanylate that bridges the gap between the tongue and the limbic system. The finish, a precise ratio of toasted Kashmiri chili and the lutein-rich saffron I had secured with my sovereign fund. When these elements are combined at the correct thermal threshold, they create a sensory experience that the brain perceives as truth. It doesn't just taste good. It creates a neurological Pavlovian response. It induces a state of safety in an ancestral memory of the hearth that makes the diner feel, for the first time in their modern high-speed life, entirely seen. The diplomacy of essence. Did Bradley really think I had become so senile that I would forget the mathematics of the tongue? He sells packs that save the trouble of thinking. I am creating a flavor that makes it impossible to forget. As I blended the first master batch, the scent began to change. It was no longer the smell of a derelict building. It was a heavy, intoxicating aroma that seemed to have its own gravity. It was the scent of truth and honor. I felt my quiet wisdom manifesting in the physical world. I looked at my hands. They were stained dark by the garlic and stained yellow by the saffron. And they were the hands of a woman who had been told she was a biochemical liability. But as I tasted the blend, just a microscopic crystal on the tip of my finger, I felt a surge of sublime power. My palate hadn't diminished with age. It had crystallized. The strategic siege. Bradley's empire was built on the materialistic assumption that people want efficiency. He thought they wanted to eat in 3 minutes so they could get back to their spreadsheets. He failed to realize that the more digital the world becomes, the more the human animal hungers for the ancestry of brick and mortar. I wasn't just opening a restaurant. I was setting a trap. I knew that the ventilation system of the Thorn Tower was designed to pull in fresh air from the street level. By simmering my sovereign broth in the bakery's old industrial kettles, and I wouldn't need to buy a single ad. The scent would penetrate the glass. It would seep into the executive boardrooms and the efficiency labs. It would act as a chemical siren, calling the vultures away from their sterile thorn pucks and back to the fire. "So this is how I repay you, Bradley," I whispered to the empty room, my voice firm and decisive. "You took my stove to save on the utility bill. I'm taking your customers to save their souls." The turning point had been reached. I had the fund, I had the building, and now I had the hidden weapon, a spice blend that could make a king beg for a bowl of soup. I looked at the Thorn Tower one last time before the sun set. It looked fragile. It looked like a house of cards waiting for a single, honest breeze to knock it down. And I was about to provide the wind. Reflection. Dignity is a slow-cooked dish. We are a generation obsessed with the quick bite, forgetting that the things that nourish us most are the ones that take the longest to clarify. Bradley Thorne thought he could optimize the chef out of the equation. He didn't realize that in the war between the machine and the soul always has the better spice rack. Expert guide. Question: Clara is using her quiet wisdom to create something addictive but wholesome. In a world of synthetic fast food, is it ethical to use sovereign science to win back the public's palate? Or is she just a more sophisticated version of the man she's fighting? Bradley and Mia were so absorbed in the digital mirage of their upcoming Thornpuck 2.0 launch that they didn't even notice I had vanished from the domestic sphere for 12 hours a day. To them, my absence was merely another symptom of my obsolescence. They assumed I was at the public library, perhaps staring blankly at microfiche, or wandering the park to keep my archaic joints from seizing up. "Glad to see you're finally getting some fresh air, Clara," Bradley said one evening, his eyes glued to a projected sales heat map. "It's better than hovering over a disconnected stove like a ghost. By the way, Thorn Tower is having its quarterly efficiency audit next month. All the top critics will be there. We're going to prove that Thorn can produce a Michelin-level experience through pure automation. No humans, no errors, just the brand." "I wish you luck, Bradley," I replied, my voice steady, carrying the clear-headed, sharp tone of a woman who had already moved her chess pieces across the board. Efficiency is such a clean goal, the architecture of the sovereign. While Bradley optimized his meat slurry, I was across the street, breathing life into the ancestry of brick-and-mortar. The sovereign was transforming. I didn't want the cold luxury of his glass spire. I wanted the heat of the earth. I used the sovereign fund to strip away the drywall, revealing the original 19th century red brick. I replaced the linoleum with reclaimed mahogany that felt like velvet underfoot. But the heart of the operation was the kitchen. I bypassed the smart sensors and automated reheat platforms Bradley worshipped. Instead, I installed heavy-bottom copper ranges and a wood-fired stone hearth. I wanted the scent of real yeast, roasting marrow, and charred ginger to drift across the 4-lane highway. I wanted the aroma to seep into the ventilation intake of Thorn Tower, a sensory Trojan horse that would bypass their high-tech air filtration and speak directly to the starving souls inside. The assembly of the discarded kitchen is nothing without its brigade, but I didn't hire from the corporate headhunters. I looked for the rejects, the young, hard-working chefs who had been fired from Bradley's efficiency labs for being too slow or for deviating from the Thornpack protocol. I found Marcus, a 24-year-old who had been reprimanded for hand-whisking a sauce instead of using the Thorn emulsifier. I found Sarah, who had been liquidated because she insisted on tasting the ingredients before they were vacuum sealed. "In this kitchen," I told them, standing before the glowing embers of the hearth, "speed is a secondary metric. Our primary metric is the truth. We do not follow a protocol. We follow the flavor." I began teaching them the diplomatic secrets I had honed at the State Department. I taught them that a sauce is not a delivery system. It is a conversation. We spent hours perfecting the reduction for the sovereign broth, ensuring the concentration of glutamic acid reached the exact threshold required to trigger a deep, biological sense of security. And I would stand by the mahogany bar of the Sovereign and look out the window. The spatial contrast was jarring. Across the street, the Thorn Tower was a pillar of blue light and sterile glass, a digital mirage where people ate standing up, staring at screens. Here, inside the Sovereign, the air was amber and gold. The copper pots gleamed like armor. Bradley thought he was the king of the future because he had removed the chef from the equation. He didn't realize that by removing the human element, he had created a vacuum. And as any scientist of the soul knows, nature abhors a vacuum. "So this is how they repay me," I whispered to the darkening room. "By assuming I have no more fire to give? They've forgotten that a fire, when contained correctly, can power an empire. But when ignored, it can burn one to the ground." I was no longer the ghost of sacrifice. I was the architect of a sensory revolution. The hidden weapon was loaded, the spices were blended, and the efficiency audit was only weeks away. Bradley was preparing to show the world his zero-chef future. I was preparing to remind the world that they were still human. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after Bradley had disconnected my stove and relegated me to a zero-chef existence, I opened the heavy mahogany doors of the Sovereign and let the war begin. The air in Oak Haven was crisp, a lingering bite of early spring that made the warmth radiating from my new kitchen feel like a physical embrace. I had arrived at 5 a.m., while Bradley was likely still asleep in his high thread count sheets, dreaming of margin optimization. I was back in my whites, my feet planted firmly on the reclaimed wood floors, tending to the 3 50-gallon copper stock pots that were the lungs of my operation. The biological Trojan horse. I hadn't spent a single cent on digital marketing. I didn't need to. I understood a principle of strategic intelligence that Bradley's algorithms could never quantify. The human nose is the shortest path to the human soul. By 10 a.m., the signature Sovereign broth had reached its peak. It was a complex architecture of flavors, 48-hour beef marrow, charred ginger, and my secret Sovereign blend. The science behind it was absolute. The concentration of natural L-glutamic acid had reached the precise threshold required to trigger a primal biological response in the human brain. It was a scent that whispered of safety, of home, and of a truth and honor that had been missing from the modern diet for decades. I opened the transoms above the mahogany doors. I had calculated the wind direction. A gentle easterly breeze was blowing directly toward the intake vents of Thorn Tower, across the street. My scent was a sensory Trojan horse. It drifted over the 4-lane highway, seeped into the glass lobby of Bradley's headquarters, and rose through the elevator shafts, bypassing his smart air filtration systems and speaking directly to the starving limbic systems of his employees. The migration of the vultures. At 11:30 a.m., the lunch rush began. Usually the Thorn Tower lobby would be a buzzing hive of executives and analysts funneling into the Thorn's Quick Bite Express Lab. But today, the hive was broken. I stood behind the mahogany bar, my spine straight, my eyes sharp. Through the large front windows, I watched the doors of Thorn Tower open. A group of junior analysts stepped out, their heads snapping toward the street like hounds catching a scent. They didn't look at the Quick Bite signage. They looked across the street at the warm, amber glow of the Sovereign. The first customer was a young man named David, a lead auditor I recognized from Bradley's accounting department. He walked in tentatively, his face gray, with the corporate fatigue of 1,000 thorn pucks. I smelled this from the 14th floor, he whispered, his eyes wide as they adjusted to the warmth of the room. What is it? It's an old diplomatic secret, David, I said, my voice carrying the quiet wisdom of a woman who had fed kings. I placed a bowl of the broth before him, clear, golden, and vibrating with life. It's called the truth. It doesn't save you time. It gives you back your soul. He took a spoonful. I watched his eyes close. I watched his shoulders, which had been hiked up to his ears in stress, finally drop. He didn't just eat. He breathed. By 12:15 p.m., the line for the sovereign stretched around the corner, a human chain of people defecting from the digital mirage of the tower, the view from the 40th floor. I looked up. High above, in the floor-to-ceiling glass office of the 40th floor, I could see a silhouette standing at the window. It was Bradley. Even from this distance, I could sense his confusion, his arrogance being punctured by the sight of his own board members standing in line on a sidewalk for a bowl of outdated soup. He was looking down at his empty lobby, then at my crowded door. He was checking his data, his heat maps, and his temporal efficiencies. But none of them could explain why his empire was leaking people toward a derelict bakery. So this is how you repay me, Bradley, by assuming my fire had gone out. And did you really think I had become that senile, that I wouldn't recognize that the more digital the world becomes, the more it hungers for the ancestry of brick and mortar? My strategic intelligence had been right. You can automate the process, but you cannot automate the response. My kindness was never a doormat. It was the foundation I had used to build a fortress he couldn't touch. By 2 p.m., we were sold out. The scent of war had been caught, and Bradley Thorne's zero-chef future was officially on notice. The turning point wasn't a stock market crash. It was a single honest bowl of soup that reminded the world they were still human. The digital mirage of Thorne Tower was designed to be impenetrable, a fortress of glass and high-frequency algorithms that dictated what the city ate. But as the sun rose on Friday, May 22nd, 2026, the fortress began to leak. Word of the sovereign had moved through the city, not like a marketing campaign, but like a fever. It wasn't just foodie hype. It was a biological correction. People weren't just coming for a meal. They were coming for an intervention. I stood behind the mahogany counter of the sovereign, my spine straight, my white chef's jacket crisp and starched. Through the window, I watched the vultures assemble. Influencers with ring lights and analysts with tablets were gathered on the sidewalk, their noses tilted upward, caught in the invisible net of my sovereign's spice. The scent, a dense, a vibrating atmosphere of charred ginger, fermented black garlic, and the primal depth of glutamic acid, had become a physical landmark in the city. The day of the audit today was Bradley's efficiency audit. He had spent 6 months and $4 million preparing for this moment. Julian Vane, the most feared food critic on the East Coast, a man with a surgical palate and a reputation for destroying billion-dollar brands with a single paragraph, was scheduled to review the Thorne Express lab in the lobby across the street. Bradley wanted to prove that his zero-chef model was the future. He wanted to show Vane that a machine could replicate the sublime. But Julian Vane never made it to the Thorne lobby. I saw his Blacktown car pull to the curb. Vane stepped out, straightened his linen blazer, and paused. And he looked toward the glass doors of Thorn Tower, where Bradley and a phalanx of PR executives were waiting with practiced smiles. Then he stopped. He sniffed the air. He turned his head slowly toward the warm amber glow of the Sovereign. The strategic intelligence of his own biology took over. He ignored the PR team's frantic waving and crossed the 4-lane highway, drawn by the ancestry of brick-and-mortar that lived in my steam. The encounter with the truth. The bell above my door jingled, a soft, silver sound. Julian Vane walked in, his eyes scanning the mahogany, the copper, and the flickering fire of the hearth. The spatial contrast between the cold street and my sanctuary seemed to daze him. He sat at the counter directly in front of my station. "I was supposed to be across the street," Vane said, his voice a low, cultivated rasp. "But the air over there smells of ozone and plastic. This smells of an old world I thought we had paved over." I didn't offer him a menu. I didn't give him a Thorn Pack calorie count. I placed a bowl of my signature Sovereign broth before him, a liquid so clear it reflected his own stunned expression, yet so deep it seemed to hold the weight of the earth. "It's an old diplomatic secret, Julian," I said, my voice carrying the quiet wisdom of a woman who had once navigated the tensions of the Cold War with a spoon. "It's called the truth. It is the result of 48 hours of silence and the truth and honor of real fire." He took the first spoonful. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. His eyes didn't just close. They squeezed shut. I saw his hand tremble as he lowered the spoon. And the Sovereign spice, the natural umami bomb, was hitting his nervous system, bypassing his cynical digital mind and speaking directly to his marrow. The architect of flavor. "I haven't tasted this specific architecture of spice in 30 years, Vane whispered, looking at me with a sudden piercing intensity. 1994. The G7 summit in Paris. There was a legendary meal served to the German chancellor, a lamb stew that reportedly brought the entire room to a standstill. They called the woman behind it the architect of flavor. She was a ghost of sacrifice who vanished after the treaties were signed. He leaned in, his eyes catching the light of the fire. He looked at the State Department seal embroidered discreetly on my cuff, the one Bradley had never bothered to ask about. "You," he breathed. "You're Clara Vance, the royal chef." "I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish," I replied, my voice firm and decisive. Bradley Thorn told the world that the chef was an outdated encumbrance. He thought he could optimize the human soul out of the kitchen. He forgot that the more digital the world becomes, the more it hungers for the ancestry of brick and mortar. The viral reckoning. Julian Vane didn't stay for the main course. He didn't need to. He stood up, bowed to me, a gesture of truth and honor I hadn't seen in decades, and walked out. An hour later, the review hit the digital front pages. It wasn't a review. It was a declaration of war. While Bradley Thorn attempts to feed us with algorithms and sterile packs, across the street, a queen has reclaimed her throne. Clara Vance, the legendary royal chef of the State Department, has returned. Her food isn't just good, it is a sensory revolution. Thorn Tower is a digital mirage of success. The Sovereign is the ancestry of brick and mortar that will outlast us all. The king of efficiency is dead. Long live the queen. The review didn't just break the internet, it broke Bradley's spine. By 3 p.m., the line for the Sovereign was 4 blocks long. Across the street, the Thorn Express lab sat empty, its sterile white lights illuminating a lobby of ghosts. So this is how they repay me, Bradley, by assuming my fire had gone out. Did you really think you could win a war of essence with a machine? The turning point was complete. I looked at the shimmering glass tower one last time as the sun began to set. It looked like a jagged tooth waiting to be pulled. The hidden weapon had been fired, and the world was finally, beautifully, hungry for the truth. The mahogany doors of the Sovereign didn't just open at 2 p.m. They were nearly hounded off their hinges. The warm, amber-lit sanctuary of my dining room, a space I had carefully curated to be a spatial contrast to the sterile glass across the street, was suddenly pierced by the cold, jagged energy of the digital mirage. Bradley Thorn didn't enter like a son-in-law. He entered like a deposed king looking for someone to blame for the gravity that had finally claimed his crown. Behind him, Mia trailed like a ghost, her face pale, clutching a smartphone that was likely vibrating with the death rattles of their stock price. The restaurant was at peak capacity. At the corner table sat Julian Vane, finishing his 3rd bowl of my signature Sovereign broth. Scattered among the other tables were 3 members of Bradley's own board of directors, men who had spent their lunch hour defecting from the efficiency lab to experience the ancestry of brick-and-mortar I had built. The collision of 2 worlds. Bradley didn't care about the diners. He marched toward the mahogany bar, his tailored suit gleaming with the cold luxury of a man who still believed his silhouette mattered more than his substance. He slammed a printed copy of the Vogue Digital Review onto the wood, right next to a pristine porcelain bowl of my consommé. "What is this, Clara?" Bradley's voice wasn't just loud. It was brittle, the sound of glass under pressure. "Sabotage. You used the money we gave you to stay in our house to build a rival shop. You're using Thorn proprietary logistics to steal our lunch crowd. This is a breach of every family agreement we ever had." I didn't stop my work. I was currently finishing a reduction, the steam carrying the heavy, intoxicating scent of charred ginger and my secret spice blend. I felt a clear-headed, sharp tone settle over me. The choking sorrow I had felt when he disconnected my stove was gone, replaced by the surgical precision of a royal chef. "The money you gave me, Bradley?" I asked, finally turning to face him. My voice was low, but in the sudden silence of the room, it carried to every corner. "You mean the $400,000 I gave you? The life insurance from my husband that built the very tower you're currently losing?" "I didn't use your money. I used my own strategic intelligence. I used the sovereign fund you were too arrogant to realize I possessed. The science of the deception." Bradley's face turned a mottled, violent purple. "You're a thief. You're using chemical triggers to trick people. I know your secret. You're just spiking the food with additives." I walked around the bar, wiping my hands on my crisp white apron. I picked up his Thornpuck 2.0 that he had tossed onto the counter, a gray, vacuum-sealed disc of soy protein and ammonia-treated scraps. "No, Bradley," I said, holding the puck up so the entire room, including his board of directors, could see it. "You're the one who uses tricks. You use E621, monosodium glutamate, and E631, disodium inosinate, to force a reaction from a tongue that's already bored of your cardboard. My food works because I understand the sublime chemistry of nature. I turn to the board members. He calls my cooking outdated. But what Bradley doesn't understand is the Maillard reaction, the actual chemical transformation of amino acids and reducing sugars that gives real food its soul. He thinks he can bypass time with a microwave. The sovereign spice isn't a chemical additive, I continued, my voice gaining a firm and decisive edge. It is the synergistic alignment of natural glutamic acid from kelp and 5' ribonucleotides from dried mushrooms. It's not a trick, Bradley. It's truth and honor. It's what happens when you treat a diner like a human being instead of a delivery system for calories. The public reversal. "I'll sue you," Bradley screamed, his delusions of power reaching their breaking point. "I'll have this place boarded up by dinner. You're a liability, Clara. You're a senile old woman playing with fire." I didn't flinch. I reached under the counter and pulled out a legal folder, my own hidden weapon. "I may be old, Bradley, but I am not foolish," I said. "You've forgotten who built this empire, this building? I bought it under a sovereign trust 6 months ago. And as for your tower, Mia, tell him." Mia stepped forward, her voice a thin, broken thread. "Bradley, the board just called an emergency meeting because of the vein review and the falling sales. They've triggered the quality clause in your contract. They're voting to remove you as CEO. And the building, the land it sits on, it's leased through a holding company owned by my mother." The silence in the Sovereign was absolute. You could hear the faint crackle of the wood fire in the hearth. "You told me my cooking was a biochemical liability," I said, stepping closer to him until the scent of real salt and honest fire forced him to blink. "You forced me to eat canned sludge because you said my palate was outdated. But look around you, Bradley. These people aren't eating your packs. They are eating the very experiments you tried to wash down the drain." The final strike. Bradley looked at his board of directors. They didn't look back. They were busy finishing their soup. He looked at Mia, but she was looking at the copper pots, her eyes filled with a recognition she had suppressed for years. "My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Bradley," I said, my voice now fast and signifying victory. "You thought you could optimize the chef out of the kitchen, but you forgot that the kitchen is the heart of the home, and without a heart, your tower is just a glass cage." I pointed to the mahogany doors. "Now please leave. You're distracting my guests, and they've waited far too long for a meal that actually matters." Bradley Thorne, the king of efficiency, turned and walked out of the warm, amber light of the Sovereign into the cold gray shadow of his own failing monument. He didn't check his watch. He didn't look at his tablet. For the first time in his life, he was a man who realized that he was perfectly, efficiently empty. The collapse of an empire doesn't always sound like a thunderclap. Sometimes it is merely the rhythmic digital beep of a stock ticker hitting absolute zero. It was late June 2026, and from the mahogany-framed windows of the Sovereign, I watched the lights in Thorne Tower flicker and die. The glass spire that had once been a monument to cold luxury and the digital mirage now looked like a jagged hollow tooth against the twilight. Bradley's zero-chef future was undergoing a violent spatial defragmentation, and no amount of high-frequency trading could stop the gravity of the truth. Bradley, in his frantic arrogance, had refused to learn the lesson of the broth. Instead of seeking the quiet wisdom of the hearth, he had doubled down on his strategic intelligence. He had spent his final millions on a team of flavor engineers from Silicon Valley, tasking them with reverse engineering my sovereign spice. They used gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to map the molecular peaks of my fermented black garlic and sun-dried kelp. They identified the glutamic acid levels and the 5' ribonucleotide synergies. But because they viewed flavor as a math problem rather than a biological narrative, they attempted a synthetic bypass. They substituted natural aged complexity with high fructose corn syrup, E635, and industrial-grade yeast extracts. It was a digital mirage of flavor, a chemical photocopy of a masterpiece. The biological rejection. The human body cannot be lied to indefinitely. The Thornpuck 2.0 didn't just taste hollow, yet it was a biochemical liability. Within weeks of the launch, the public began to react. The press called it the thorn tremor, a physiological rejection of the hyper-processed slurry. Lawsuits flooded the courts, alleging deceptive marketing and nutritional fraud. The board of directors, those vultures who had once cheered for Bradley's efficiency, were the first to flee the carcass. The stock didn't just drop, it was delisted. The fast food king was being stripped of his crown by the very consumers he had treated as delivery systems for calories. His tower was seized by creditors, and the sterile kitchen where he had once dumped my soul was boarded up, its stainless steel surfaces gathering the dust of a failed ideology. The daughter's return. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Mia finally walked back through the mahogany doors of the Sovereign. She didn't look like a vice president of operations anymore. The sharp, materialistic edges of her designer suit were frayed, and the corporate fatigue she once wore as a badge of status had turned into a raw, hollow exhaustion. She didn't come with a tablet or a stopwatch. She came with a damp coat and a broken spirit. She sat at the bar, not in the center of the room, but in the shadows, breathing in the scent of real wood and roasting marrow. I didn't say a word. I simply placed a bowl of warm, clarified consommé in front of her. No RFID tags, no automated reheating, just the truth and honor of the flame. "He's broken, Mom," Mia whispered, her voice a fragmented shadow of the woman who had once ordered me to eat canned soup. "The banks took the mansion. They took the smart home. He spends all day in a cramped studio apartment, staring at a laptop, trying to recalculate the variables. He still thinks it was a glitch in the algorithm. He still thinks you cheated." The royal chef's verdict. I leaned against the mahogany bar, looking at my daughter, the girl I had once taught to distinguish the subtle notes of real saffron. The choking sorrow I had felt months ago had evolved into a sublime clarity. "He went wrong at the sink, Mia," I said, my voice firm and signifying victory. "He thought he was washing away a soup. He was actually washing away a foundation. You cannot build a billion-dollar future on a lie that ignores the heart. You thought my cooking was an outdated encumbrance, but it was the only thing in that house that was actually real." Mia took a spoonful of the broth. I watched as the sovereign spice hit her nervous system, triggering the same biological recognition I had seen in Julian Vane. For the first time in years, the mask of the digital mirage slipped. She wept, not for the lost stock options or the glass office, but for the realization that she had been starving in a house full of food. "So this is how they repay me?" I asked softly, though the question was no longer for her. "By proving that the archaic is the only thing that survives the crash?" Bradley Thorne had optimized himself out of a family, out of a career, and out of a soul. He had replaced the chef with a process, only to find that the process had no one to feed. As Mia sat there, finely nourished by the ancestry of brick-and-mortar, I realized that the war was over. The tower was dark, the king was in exile, and the royal chef was exactly where she belonged, at the fire, tending to the truth. The morning sun of July 2026 hits the red brick of the Sovereign with a warmth that feels like a benediction. Inside, the air is a thick, fragrant tapestry of roasting marrow, clarified butter, and the sharp, bright citrus of hand-zested lemons. It is a sublime atmosphere, a world away from the pressurized, ozone-scented efficiency labs across the street. Thorne Tower still stands, but it is a hollow monument, its glass windows reflecting the sky like the eyes of a corpse. The digital mirage has finally evaporated, leaving behind only the cold reality of a failed algorithm. I was sitting at the mahogany bar, reviewing the morning's shipment of lutein-rich saffron, when the heavy front doors creaked open. It wasn't the sharp silver jingle of a customer. It was a hesitant, heavy sound. Bradley Thorne walked in, and he didn't look like a fast food king. The tailored Italian wool was gone, replaced by a tattered, off-brand trench coat that smelled of damp pavement and desperation. His face, once sharp with arrogance and the delusions of power, was now gray and sagging, mapped with the fine lines of a man who had spent 3 months staring into the abyss of a negative balance sheet. He didn't have a tablet. He didn't have a stopwatch. He only had his hands, which were trembling. The request for the process. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried across the room. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at the gleaming copper pots hanging above the range, the very pots he had once called a spatial liability. "I've been to 22 firms," he continued, his words tripping over each other. "Nobody wants to hire the efficiency king who crashed a billion-dollar brand. They say my methods are toxic. They say I'm a biochemical liability to their corporate culture. Mia, she's working 3 jobs, Clara. We lost the house. We lost everything." He finally looked at me, and I saw the choking sorrow of a man who had optimized himself out of a life. "I heard you need a dishwasher," he said. "I know I said your kitchen was archaic. I know I said you were outdated. But I'm good with systems. I can follow a process. I just need to eat, Clara." The foundation of the trench, I stood up, my spine straight, my white chef's jacket a shield of truth and honor. I looked at the man who had once poured my soul down a kitchen disposal, and I felt a surge of quiet wisdom, a calm that only comes when you have finally outlasted your enemies. "A kitchen is a hierarchy, Bradley," I said, my voice firm and signifying victory. "It is the ancestry of brick and mortar. You thought you could start at the top by removing the heart. But in this house, we start at the bottom. We start in the wet trenches." I walked him to the back of the kitchen, past the wood-fired hearth and the simmering stock pots, to the industrial dishwashing station. In a real kitchen, the dishwasher is the most important person in the room, I explained, gesturing to the 3-compartment sink and the heavy-duty sprayer. If the plates aren't clean, the sublime flavor of the sovereign spice doesn't matter. If the pots aren't scoured, and the Maillard reaction is ruined by the ghosts of yesterday's failures, I handed him a heavy-duty rubber apron and a coarse steel wool pad. You told me my cooking was a biochemical liability, I said, stepping closer until he could smell the honesty of the fire on my clothes. You forced me to eat canned sludge because you said my labor was stingy and archaic. Well, Bradley, now you get to see exactly what that labor feels like. There is no algorithm for a burnt-on reduction. There is no smart sensor for grease. There is only the hard-working reality of the hand and the water. The final sentence. Bradley took the apron, his knuckles white. He looked at the mountain of copper pans waiting to be scoured, the remains of a lunch rush that had served 300 people. The truth. What's the thermal profile for the rinse? He asked, a ghost of his old efficiency habit flickering in his eyes. The thermal profile is hot enough to hurt, I replied. The shift starts at 5 a.m. You stay until the copper shines like a mirror. You stay until you understand that a process is nothing without the soul of the person performing it. And Bradley, if I see a single stopwatch, you're out on the street. I walked back to my mahogany bar and poured myself a cup of dark, roasted coffee. I watched him through the pass-through window, the former billionaire hunched over a sink, finally engaging with the ancestry of brick-and-mortar. The philosophical reflection. We spend our lives chasing the digital mirage, building empires of glass and speed, thinking we can optimize the human experience into a thorn pack. We treat our elders like outdated encumbrances, forgetting that they are the ones who know where the fire is kept. But gravity always wins. The cold luxury of the algorithm will always collapse when it meets the truth and honor of real salt, real fire, and real time. Dignity is not something you are given in a stock option. It is something you earn stitch by stitch, simmer by simmer, and plate by plate. I am Clara Vance. I am 70 years old. I have fed kings. I have survived vultures, and I have reclaimed my throne. My kindness was never a doormat. It was the foundation of an empire that Bradley Thorne was too efficient to ever understand. As I look across the street at the dark, empty tower, I realize that the greatest dignity rise isn't the victory over another person. It's the moment you realize that your fire was never theirs to put out. The stove is hot. The spices are blended. And for the first time in my life, I am truly, sublimely free. The royal chef's closing moral. Time is the only ingredient you cannot fake, and respect is the only currency that never devalues. If you try to feed the world a lie, eventually you will be the one left hungry at the back of the house.